They wrote good afternoon, but it's good morning. Good morning. I call this meeting to order. A quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. And pursuant to Committee Rule 4 and House Rule 11, Clause 2H4, the chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered. The committee procedures for remote hearings remain the same. If you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so those issues can be resolved immediately. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veteransaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. Previously unfiled amendments should be submitted there as well. Does any member have a question about the procedures for today's meeting? On hearing none or seeing none, we will proceed. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Throughout the 117th Congress, I have been focused on creating an environment at VA that is welcoming, inclusive, and reflective of the needs of all veterans. I've made this a top priority for this committee, and the 17 bills on today's markup agenda will help ensure that we get closer to that goal. From equitable access to health care and benefits to strengthening programs that will help veterans lead a life of meaning and purpose. These bills will help strengthen the institution tasked with serving our increasingly diverse veteran population. Among the legislation we'll consider this morning is a bill that will improve the experiences of veteran moms who receive care at VA medical centers. We'll also take up 4 bills to address the treatment of military sexual trauma, Mst survivors at VA. These bills will improve intra-agency coordination, instill dignity during the claims process, and establish peer support designed specifically for survivors of MST. We'll also consider a bill that requires VA to partner with minority-serving institutions to recruit staff, helping develop a more diverse workforce that serves the needs of all veterans. In addition, we will mark up 3 bills to enhance oversight of VA. I was disturbed by a recent Government Accountability Office report that identified nearly 2,600 healthcare providers who were deceased, ineligible to work with the federal government, or who had revoked or suspended medical licenses, and yet were still listed as approved providers in the VA Community Care Network. Congressman Pappas's bill, H.R. 7277, will implement the resulting GAO recommendations to ensure veterans are not put at risk of receiving care from unqualified providers. We'll also consider bills to strengthen the VA Office of Inspector General's ability to perform investigations, including granting the office testimonial subpoena authority and ensuring VA employees are trained annually to understand how to engage and cooperate with the OIG. This morning, we'll also advance 4 bills related to veteran educational assistance programs. These bills expand eligibility for VA work study as well as self-employment training through the Veteran Readiness and Employment Program. We'll also direct VA to update its payment systems so that veterans can enroll in courses of study at foreign institutions. If veterans can get their care overseas, they should be able to get an education overseas as well. We have a busy agenda ahead of us this morning, one which includes several non-controversial bills supported by our minority, and I hope we can continue this committee's long history of bipartisan work to ensure we continue to deliver the care and benefits our veterans have earned and deserve. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and I really do mean that. Your being here is really essential. And with that, I now recognize Ranking Member Bost for any opening comments that he may have.
Thank you, Chairman. So before I get started here this morning, I want to take and acknowledge some heartbreaking news in the veteran community today, the passing of Dr. Kate Hendrick Thomas yesterday. Dr. Thomas was a Marine veteran who died from breast cancer after serving near burn pits in Iraq. She was 38 years old. My thoughts and prayers are with her and her family and friends. Dr. Thomas' passing is a tragic reminder of how the highest stakes are that when it comes to better serving our veterans suffering from toxic exposure, and why we must pass the Healthcare Burn Pit Veterans Act in the House and send it to the President without any further delay. Too many veterans like Dr. Thomas don't have any more time to waste. They need our help now. You know, we cannot keep waiting for the PAC Act. We need to pass this particular bill. The House should also pass Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas's Service Act. You know, the bill bears Dr. Thomas's name and would help more toxic exposed veterans like her have access to mammograms from the VA. I look forward to working with the chairman with both of these bills as we move forward as soon as possible. But with that being said, you know, we have a full agenda this morning, and I will keep my opening comments brief, and I'm very grateful to be here today with the committee and our colleagues and the chairman to consider these several pieces of legislation on behalf of the veterans' families. And I'm grateful to the chairman's willingness to work to resolve many of the differences in advance of the markup. We've been working on this particular markup with a very bipartisan manner, and I appreciate that from him and his staff. And we need to continue down that path. You know, I'm so grateful for that bipartisanship. But today's agenda includes bills that were put forward by each of our 5 subcommittees and from members on both sides of the aisle. This is a reflection of our mutual commitment to the men and women who serve, and I look forward to continuing this work this morning and continuing on with the House floor in the weeks to come. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bost. We will now move to consideration of the bills on our agenda. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 7393. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 7393 to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to develop an employee
The text was
recruitment-
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This bill, the Improving VA Workforce Through Minority Serving Institutions Act of 2022, introduced by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, requires VA to develop an improved employee recruitment and retention strategy that improves partnerships with minority-serving institutions, including historically black colleges and universities, and minority-serving professional groups. This legislation stems from a recommendation by the Department's Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. It has long been known that VA needs to improve its recruitment of minority employees, and the Congresswoman's legislation would take some very important steps in this direction. H.R. 7393 is supported by the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Disabled American Veterans, the Modern Military Association of America, and Minority Veterans of America, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Is there further debate on H.R. 7393? Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I support the intent of this bill, but have few reservations. But we know that despite our best efforts, there are still many vacancies across the VA, and I'm in strong support of the efforts to improve the recruitment at the department. This bill would require VA to create a broader strategy to fill these vacancies with graduates of minority serving institutions, including historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. I know VA already has a number of hiring programs targeting these students, and I am unsure whether the existing program fit within the current recruitment strategies or whether it will require VA to create a new strategy. Unfortunately, VA did not discuss this bill specifically in its testimony at the subcommittee legislative hearing. Therefore, to ensure the bill is not a solution to in search of a problem, I would like to receive VA's views and justifications for this legislation before we consider the bill on the floor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any other comment or discussion of the bill? If not, I move that H.R. 7393 be favorably reported to the House. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Ranking Member.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 7393.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. We will now consider H.R. 6961. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 6961 to
The
amend
text was
title.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Mr. Mervan, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your bill.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. I am proud to have introduced H.R. 6961, the Dignity for Mst Survivors Act, and to be working alongside Chairman Takano and Chairwoman Lowry and my other House colleagues to address longstanding issues regarding the treatment of survivors and military sexual trauma. The Dignity for Mst Survivors Act seeks to support and affirm veterans who experienced sexual trauma during their military service as they navigate the Board of Veterans' Appeals claims appeal process. According to the data collected by the Department of Veteran Affairs, an unconscionable 1 in 3 of our brave women veterans and 1 in 50 male veterans report having experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment. Such traumatic events often have lasting impacts on these individuals' physical and mental health, placing MST survivors at the heightened risk for depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other debilitating conditions. Despite these clear treatment needs, many MST survivors face significant difficulty in accessing health care and disability benefits from VA. On August 2021, an investigation released by VA's Office of the Inspector General found that an astounding 57% of denied MST claims were improperly processed by VA, in part due to claims processors' lack of MST training. Multiple veteran service organizations report that the BVA has proven similarly ill-equipped to deal with the appeals of denied MST claims, and that the current claims appeal process has the unfortunate potential to re-traumatize MST survivors. While VA has taken steps in the right direction, more must be done to improve the claims appeal experience, show compassion, and safeguard the dignity of MST survivors. The Dignity for MST Survivors Act would restore dignity to the claims appeals process by requiring the VA Secretary to ensure BVA members complete annual MST training in order to continue hearing appeals. It would also require VA to review the language used in claims denial letters to ensure such language is carefully worded in order to avoid any re-traumatization of our veterans. Finally, it would mandate that contract medical providers conduct MST-related examinations in a sensitive, trauma-informed manner. I look forward to continuing to work with Chairman Takano and Chairwoman Lauria and my other House colleagues in order to ensure MST survivors are not re-traumatized at any point in their effort to obtain world-class health care and disability benefits to which they are entitled. I would also like to thank the veterans of foreign wars, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the American Legion, and the Wounded Warrior Project for their endorsements of this legislation. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 6961, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. The focus on the treatment of our veterans who have had to experience MST cannot be understated. Words have meaning and power, and language we use can itself be re-traumatizing for MST survivors. Therefore, much thought should be given to the way in which VA corresponds with veterans who have MST claims. Accordingly, this bill requires that VA confer with stakeholders to identify appropriate language for inclusion in denial letters. Additionally, the Board of Veterans' Appeals does significant work, including the processing of appeals for MST. Given the extremely sensitive nature of these claims, board members must be adequately trained to review the cases. Therefore, this legislation includes an annual training element. Further, if board members do not meet this annual training requirement, they will not be assigned MST cases. The training and development of contract medical providers is also paramount to conducting MST compensation exams. Consequently, this bill will require these medical providers to use the most up-to-date trauma-informed protocols during the course of their work with veterans seeking MST claims. I encourage my colleagues to support this vital legislation. Is there further debate on the bill?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Ranking Member?
Yeah, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
The text was
6961.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, you're recognized for 5 minutes to speak in favor or in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As ranking member of the committee, I'm committed to improve VA service and benefits for survivors of military sexual trauma, or MST. And I appreciate Representative Mervan for introducing this bill, which would enhance training for MST for adjudicators at the Board of Veterans Appeals, and improve decision notices for claims related to MST, and require VA to establish standards to ensure that contract disability examiners conduct exams related to MST using trauma-informed practices. My amendment would require VA to also apply the same standards to VHA examiners who provide MST-related exams. No veteran should feel uncomfortable when they receive a disability exam. I appreciate the majority's willingness to work with me and on this, and I urge my members to support the amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Mervan?
Chairman Takano, I support Ranking Member Bost's amendment to H.R. 6961, which I believe improves my legislation by ensuring that all VA professionals who work with MST survivors, including medical providers, have received appropriate training and are treating MST survivors with the utmost dignity. I thank Ranking Member Bost for his amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan, and thank you, Mr. Bost. While it is my understanding that currently most MST claims exams are being outsourced to contract providers, I appreciate that for those that are conducted by in-house VA providers, the same training mandated for contract providers by the underlying bill would prove useful. As such, I also support your amendment, and I urge its adoption. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the Bost amendment to H.R. 6961? Hearing none and seeing none, the question is now on the Bost amendment to H.R. 6961. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee. Mr. Chairman, I remove the committee report H.R. 6961 as amended, favorable to the full House of Representatives.
The question is now on moving H.R. 6961 and reporting it favorably to the House. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6961 as amended.
Without objection, so ordered, and without objection, the staff was authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. We will now consider H.R. 2724. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2724.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and I recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2724, offered by Mr. Takano.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with and is considered as read and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Without objection, a statement from the bill's sponsor, Representative Delgado, in support of the underlying bill will be included in the hearing record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on my amendment in the nature of a substitute. VA has used peer support specialists for veterans recently discharged who are in transition to assist veterans with mental health or substance abuse issues and for caregivers of veterans. As peer support programs have been successful for the aforementioned populations, peer support for MST survivors may prove to be a beneficial tool during the claims process. Victim advocacy can serve as a liaison between victims and the entity adjudicating their cases. Now, within the MST context, a highly trained peer support specialist can serve as an advocate who can provide counsel, assistance, and coordination to navigate a process that may be stress-inducing and anxiety-provoking. If the MST claimant chooses to utilize the services of a peer support specialist, the MST claims experience may go more smoothly, potentially reducing the strain on an inherently difficult process. As such, I appreciate Representative Delgado introducing the underlying bill, and I'm pleased to be offering this amendment in the nature of a substitute, which addresses technical assistance provided by VA. I encourage my colleagues to support it and urge its adoption. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2724?
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking member?
I have an amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute
The
to
text was
HR.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes to discuss your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would clarify the role of VHA per support specialist who would provide services to certain claimants under this bill. Peer support specialists provide critical help to veterans by sharing their own experiences overcoming life's challenges. Unfortunately, many veterans who file a claim for a condition based on MST may not be aware of or eligible for VHA peer support services. This bill would better ensure that MST claimants are connected with an MST coordinator or peer support specialist at the VHA. My amendment would clarify the peer support specialist can provide counseling services to the veteran who may have difficulty coping with recounting their MST event during the claims process. My amendment would also make it clear that the peer support specialist cannot provide claims advocacy services such as sharing a veteran's personal story during the BVA hearing. This would ensure that the peer support specialists are not put in a difficult position with the veteran if the VA denies their claim. I appreciate Chairman Takano for working with me to address my concerns, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I fully support your amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by you, and to clarify the role of the peer support specialist in assisting an MST claimant. It is the intent of the bill's sponsor, Representative Delgado, that the peer support specialist is to act as a shepherd for the MST claimant, providing guidance and support and counseling, and helping them to navigate a difficult and often re-traumatizing process, rather than a surrogate who is speaking on behalf of the claimant during the proceedings. And as such, the amendment by Representative Bost to insert clarifying language is useful in adding context. I again support its adoption. Is there further debate on the Bost amendment or any other part of the bill of the ANS? Ms. Mace, I understand you want to be recognized.
Yes, sir.
Please, 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I support both the amendment in nature of a substitute, the amendment to an amendment, and the nature of the substitute. This issue is an important issue, and I remember, Mr. Chairman, when we were on our congressional delegation in the fall overseas in the Indo-Pacific region, this issue came up when we were meeting with the VA overseas. And tragically, I know all too well that as a survivor of sexual assault, that approximately 2 out of every 3 sexual assaults that occur during military service are not reported because there are concerns of retaliation, of judgment, of lack of confidentiality, or simply for fear of coming forward and being taken seriously. And this hesitation makes providing evidence of military sexual trauma problematic when a veteran files a claim for disability benefits. We know this, and based on the physical and mental impacts of their assault, it can take them a lengthy amount of time to actually come forward, and by that time, much of the evidence is already gone. MST claims that are processed. It's a complicated process. It's traumatic enough, and it often requires a survivor to retell their story of assault multiple times over, and in some cases actually relive it. And for some people, it is the worst day of their lives. The Veterans Health Administration does have a peer support system and its specialists, but its specialists are not trained to support many of these survivors. And this means they have little to no knowledge of the claims process at all when it comes to military sexual trauma. Because of this gap in training, most MST survivors find themselves navigating an already complicated and convoluted claims process at the Veterans Benefits Administration without formal mental or emotional health counseling and support. And this is why Representative Delgado and I introduced H.R. 2724, the VA Peer Support Enhancement for MST Survivors Act. This bipartisan legislation establishes a peer support program for MST survivors by ensuring every individual who files a claim related to MST is assigned a peer support specialist to provide support during the claims process. They don't have to use this person if they don't want to, but the specialist is there for their benefit. And the specialist plays no part in the adjudication process, but the veteran can elect out of receiving the support or not. This legislation takes an important step forward in making MST claims process more accessible, less intimidating, less complicated for veterans who are survivors. And I'm hopeful that this bill will make it easier for these victims to get the disability benefits they deserve. I also want to thank the VSOs who support the bill, including the Disabled American Veterans, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Legion, MVA, and Military Officers Association of America. And I want to thank the committee for their bipartisan work. I want to thank Chairman Takano and Ranking Member Bost for putting this and other very important military sexual trauma legislation forward today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Mace. Is there any further debate on the Bost amendment? If not, the question now is on the Bost amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further debate on the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2724? If not, the question is now on the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2724 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute is amended and is agreed to. As amended is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report H.R. 2724 as amended favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional or dissenting views on H.R. 2724 as amended.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 6052. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 6052, to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to require the employees of the Department of Veterans
Text was
Affairs.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Representative Underwood for 5 minutes to discuss her bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am honored that today's markup includes my Department of Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General Training Act of 2021, or VA-OIG Act. I introduced the bipartisan VA-OIG Act with Representative David McKinley of West Virginia last fall. Our bill requires every current and future VA employee to participate in the VA's OIG training, which will ensure that employees are prepared to report fraud, waste, and patient abuse, and are aware of protections for employees who report wrongdoing. During last week's legislative hearing on my bill, Mr. Chris Wilbur, the counselor to the VA Inspector General, told me that VA's OIG has seen, quote, time and time again, that there are longstanding known issues by staff that have not been reported to the OIG simply because they either did not know about the IG's authorities or were concerned about retaliation. Ensuring that VA's employees know how to report wrongdoing to the Inspector General will enhance oversight efforts, promote accountability, save thousands of taxpayer dollars, and ensure that veterans receive high-quality care and benefits. While I am encouraged that Secretary McDonough has implemented an OIG training requirement, Mr. Wilbur underscored the need to codify this requirement during last week's hearing when he noted that future secretaries could rescind this administration's training requirement, even if it's included in a VA directive. That's why it's so important that our committee advances my common sense bipartisan bill, which strengthens VA's Office of the Inspector General, supports VA employees, and most importantly, it honors our veterans by ensuring that they receive the world-class care that they've earned. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Underwood. The VA Office of Inspector General does provide critical oversight and investigations into a broad range of programs and spending by the department. Work by the Inspector General's office often informs our committee's own oversight and legislation. However, the Office of Inspector General relies on VA employees as a key source of information. The better employees are at the better employees are at communicating with OIG, the more effective the OIG is in carrying out oversight. And that's why Representative Underwood's legislation is so important. It would require all VA employees to undergo training developed by the OIG relating to reporting wrongdoing, responding to OIG requests, and cooperating with OIG investigations. I understand the minority supports the bill, and the American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars have endorsed the bill as well, and I urge my colleagues to support Ms. Underwood's legislation. Is there further debate on H.R. 6050?
Mr. Chairman.
6052, excuse me, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of H.R. 6052, which would require VA employees to receive training on the work of the Inspector General. This training would help VA employees understand how to recognize and report the instances of waste, fraud, and abuse, as well as their responsibility to comply with the Inspector General's investigation. This is a comprehensive bill that would lead to better oversight to the department. And I urge the members on our side of the aisle and all members to support this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further debate on H.R. 6052? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, and I know this isn't your responsibility on your side or ours that is causing it, but we are short a quorum now, and I apologize for that.
I hear you.
I would encourage all Republican members to please stay near their screens, and or if they can stay in the room, that would help tremendously to keep us at a quorum.
Yeah, a quorum is required during a markup, but is presumed to exist unless its absence is noted. A quorum must be reestablished after a recess. A member may make a point of order when no other member has been recognized or when
We're back up. Right.
we back up.
Well, we're back up.
Okay, so a quorum is now present. Quorum is now present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 6052 favorable to the House floor. I think I jumped ahead, didn't I? I'll do that a
Yes,
little later.
you're fine. You're fine.
Okay.
So you made a motion to
report the
report the bill favorably to the House, H.R.
Yep.
6052.
Yep.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. And without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the in-committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman, in pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice to intent to file a minority or supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6052.
Without objection. H.R. 727, we will now consider H.R. 7277. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 7277 to improve the methods by which the
Without objection,
Secretary...
the first reading is dispensed with, and I recognize Mr. Pappas to offer an amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Text was
7277.
strictly in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Mr. Pappas, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be brief. This is common sense legislation that addresses the potential for waste, fraud, and abuse within VA. And this legislation has received endorsements from VFW, the American Legion, and DAV. And I'm really happy to co-lead this bill alongside Ranking Member Mann from our Oversight Investigation Subcommittee. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, in your opening comments, the bill requires VA to improve its processes for identifying and removing ineligible healthcare providers from community care networks. 1,600 providers were identified by a GAO report in December of 2021 as being deceased, having suspended or revoked medical licenses, or otherwise being ineligible to work with the federal government to provide care for veterans. So even a relatively small number of ineligible providers in VHA's community care networks, I think, puts veterans at risk of receiving care from unqualified providers, and or it makes VA at risk of making payments to ineligible providers, some fraudulent. So I think we've heard a lot about this issue through our work on the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee, through our hearing last week. And VA is taking some steps to implement all 10 of the recommendations from GAO, but progress has been slow. And so clearly additional oversight work is needed. And I believe this legislation is needed to hold the department fully accountable and make sure it makes good on all 10 of those recommendations. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope everyone will support this common sense bipartisan proposal. I want to thank the committee staff for their work on this, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pappas. This legislation, authored by Chairman Pappas of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, would take important steps to ensure that healthcare providers meet the eligibility requirements and standards of VA's community care program. I was truly disturbed by a recent GAO report that identified approximately 1,600 healthcare providers who were deceased, ineligible to work with the federal government, or who had revoked or suspended medical licenses, yet still were listed as active providers in VHA's community care networks. Congressman Pappas's bill will require VA to implement the resulting GAO recommendations to ensure veterans are not put at risk of receiving care from unqualified providers. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes some minor changes to the bill's deadline for VA to implement the recommendations and report to Congress. The bill has the support of the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the amendment in nature of substitute to H.R. 7277?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Chairman. I support the amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 7277, this bipartisan bill led by Chairman Pappas and Ranking Member Mann of the Oversight and Investigation Committee. It would implement recent recommendations from the Government Accountability Office on how to improve oversight to the community care. Community care is VA care. It is vital to protect the increasing important options that are available to our veterans to choose where they want to receive their care and when they need it. And I look forward to a favorably report the amendment to the floor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Does any other member wish to discuss the INS? If not, I'll recognize.
Mr. Chairman, we're down on quorum again.
Okay. Let us reestablish the quorum. Okay, wait. One.
We need 2 more.
We just need to come on back on camera.
We need 1 more here and then 1 more either in person or back on. If Cawthorn can come back on camera, and we'll get 1 more.
All right. Members who are with us online, Mr. Gallego, you're back? Is that, we need 1 more. Mr. Cawthorn, if you are able to actually appear on your camera, that would be necessary for us to establish quorum. I think Ms. Radewagen just came back on, did she? So one short, okay.
We got a lot of other committees going on right now.
We do, we do. Is Mr. Rosendale going to come back on or come back?
He's 2 minutes out.
Okay, all right.
He may also want to speak on this bill.
Okay,
If you'll
that's fine, that's fine. It's a good bill. It's amazing, 1,600 people. Yeah, we have to establish a quorum.
We're good.
Okay, all right. Ms. Mace is back on. Thank you, Ms.
I'm
Mace.
still here, Chairman Takano. I'm still here waiting on you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for staying with us, Mr. Sablon, all the way. Okay. We can go ahead. All right, let's go ahead. I'm going to accept your motion.
Rosendale's now here.
Mr. Rosendale, I understand you want to speak to the ANS, the PAPAS ANS to HR 7277. Just to jog your memory, it had to do with the 1,600 practitioners. Oh, go ahead.
His mic's not working.
No, mic's not working, sir.
Slide to the next one.
Might want to just slide to the next one. No, we've had problems with that mic before. I would move to the next microphone.
We didn't know if he was going to speak on it, but there's.
Okay.
How's that? There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. The issue of community care has been one of the particular important to me and my constituents, especially in light of the recent AIR market assessments. The recommendations that came from these assessments could potentially leave veterans of Eastern Montana stranded and without VA care for literally hundreds of miles. And I get it. I understand consolidation. I certainly understand budgets. I know that it's costly to maintain a facility that serves only a small portion of a small community. I'm not going to reflexively reject a plan to close certain facilities. I just need to know for certain that the VA plans to replace those veterans' care. And that's where I see the community care playing a much bigger role. These providers already exist in the community, are well known to those who live there, and many times can see patients in a much timelier manner than the VA. I'm pleased to see HR 7277 in this markup. As much as I believe community care, recent GAO reports have shown that it's not quite veterans need them to be. This is a good foundational step and an important oversight function that will enable the network to expand and deliver more care. I'd like to thank Chairman and Representative Pappas and Mann for bringing forth this bill here and invite them and any other members to work with me to take this a step further to really bolster the community care network. I believe that would help the VA fulfill its promise, and I know veterans across Montana would like to thank you and see that as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale, and I appreciate your desire to see third-party administrators recruit more providers into community care. So I take your point. But I think before that effort can begin, we really need to focus on VA and the third-party administrators implementing the recommendations from the GAO report that led to the underlying bill being considered today. We must ensure veterans seeking care in the community are receiving those services from providers that are qualified to provide it. And I know in certain parts of the country, the third-party administrators have struggled to recruit and retain robust networks for various reasons, and frankly, a simple recruitment effort is not likely to move the needle on this issue. But I do look forward to working with you, sir, to consider such legislation through regular order. And with that, does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the ANS? If not, the question is now on the Pappas ANS to HR 7277. All those in favor will say aye.
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 Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Pappas amendment and the nature of a substitute is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 7277? 7277 as amended favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant House Rules 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority, supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 7277 as amended.
Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the committee amendments. We will now consider H.R. 2428, and the clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2428, to provide the Inspector General of the Department of Veterans Affairs testimonial subpoena authority and for other purposes. To provide
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself. The bill by Representative Rice would give the VA Office of Inspector General testimonial subpoena authority, an essential tool to fully investigate waste, fraud, and abuse. Too often, individuals with critical information about serious misconduct or even fraud retire or move on to a position in another agency, thereby evading OIG investigations. Currently, the Inspector General cannot require testimony of these former employees. This is simply not right. Questioning these individuals could shed light on wrongdoing or mismanagement that puts the care and safety of veterans and their families at risk. It is worth noting that the Inspectors General of both Departments of Defense and Health and Human Services currently have testimony subpoena authority as part of the work to oversee large healthcare systems. The bill is supported by the minority, as well as Veterans of Foreign Wars, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and the Project on Government Oversight. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. Is there any further debate on H.R. 2428?
Mr. Chairman.
Bost.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this bill that would provide Inspector General with limited subpoena power. We have seen in recent incidents where having such authority would aid the IG in completing their work. This is a good bill to expand oversight of VA, and it has my full support. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Any other member wish to speak on the bill? Now I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 2428 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make any necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 2428.
Without objection. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 7369. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 7369.
The text
to
was
amend-
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes to discuss his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including my legislation, the Veteran Eligibility for Necessities to Undertake Rewarding Entrepreneurship, or Venture Act, in today's markup. This bill expands eligibility for self-employment assistance under the Veteran Readiness and Employment, or VRE program. The VRE self-employment track helps veterans achieve their dreams of entrepreneurship by providing assistance with business plans, training in small business operations, assistance with startup costs, and more. Unfortunately, I've heard from many veteran service organizations that their members are having difficulty accessing these benefits. That's because under current law, this track is only open to veterans with the most severe service-connected disabilities who require homebound training, self-employment, or both. As a result, in 2021, only 162 veterans participated in the self-employment track out of more than 80,000 veterans using the VRE program overall. That makes it the least utilized track, accounting for approximately 1/5 of 1% of all VRE participants. It's time to open the door for more veterans with service-related disabilities to access the self-employment track and all the resources that come with it. And that's what my bill aims to do. The Venture Act will eliminate restrictions on the self-employment tracks that any veteran participating in VRE is eligible for these benefits. Veterans who've sacrificed for our country should have every opportunity to start their own business. And I hope that we can affirm that in today's vote. I urge my colleagues to support the Venture Act, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Chairman Levin's Veteran Eligibility for Necessities to Undertake Rewarding Entrepreneurship or Venture Act makes a much-needed change to veteran readiness and employment, to the VRE program, to allow more veterans the chance at starting a business. Currently, the self-employment or entrepreneur track is limited to a very small subsection of veterans eligible for VRE. The Venture Act would make all veterans that are eligible for VRE eligible for self-employment. This legislation would also maintain the goal of prioritizing those with the most severe service-connected disabilities for self-employment first. This legislation is endorsed by VFW and DAV. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. Is there further debate on H.R. 7369?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 7369, sponsored by Congressman Levin, would remove requirements that veterans participate in Veterans Readiness and Employment Program be severely disabled in order to receive funding for license and startup fees to be self-employed. By removing the requirement, and VR and E participants would be eligible for the self-employment track, potentially expanding usage of the traditional underutilized track. And I want to thank the Congressman for his hard work on this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support its passage here today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further discussion on 7369? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee on report H.R. 7369 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 Any opposed will say no. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental, additional, and dissenting views on H.R. 7369.
Without objection. I now call up H.R. 6376. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 6376.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and I recognize myself to offer an amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The text was
HR.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, is considered as read, and will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes in support of my amendment in the nature of a substitute. This legislation would allow part-time student veterans to access VA work-study programs, ensuring that they can complete their certification or degree without taking on unmanageable amounts of student debt, and still care for themselves and their families. Currently, student veterans must maintain a full class load to be eligible for work study, which for many veterans, balancing families or other work is simply not feasible. The ANS would eliminate this expansion to a 5-year, not eliminate, the ANS would limit this expansion to a 5-year pilot, which the minority requested, and will better inform us going forward on what participation would be like with a permanent change to the program. So I urge all my colleagues to support the underlying bill and the amendment in nature of a substitute to the legislation. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the ANS to H.R. 6376?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature
So
of
the text was
substitute.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support your underlying amendment and would expand eligibility for VA work-study program. And this is an important program that helps veterans gain work experience while enrolled in education or training through the GI Bill. My amendment would add an offset to the bill to account for the $19 million mandatory cost. The offset is just a 9-day expansion of the VA home loan funding fees that have been used by this committee on a bipartisan basis for many years. I thank the chairman for working with me to provide this offset, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I support your amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to fully offset the pilot program. Does any other member wish to be recognized to discuss the Bost amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6376? If not, the question is now on the Bost amendment to the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6376. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Bost amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Question is now on the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6376 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Takano amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 6376 as amended favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member.
in pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6376 as amended.
Without objection. H.R. 7375. I now call up H.R. 7375. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 7375, to direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to update
Without
the payment
objection, the first
system.
reading is dispensed with. The bill is now considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the bill. H.R. 7375 directs the VA to finally update its student payment systems to allow for educational assistance funds to be transmitted electronically to a foreign institution of higher education as long as the institution is providing an approved course of study. Representative Sherrill's legislation is a response to strong advocacy for our student veterans underlying abroad, who our student veterans studying abroad, who are often unsure how their benefits will translate overseas. I thank Representative Sherrill for offering this legislation, and I urge support and passage by all my colleagues. Is there any further discussion on H.R. 7375?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 7375, sponsored by Congresswoman Sherrill of New Jersey, would require that within 90 days of the enactment, the VA update the electronic fund transfer systems for education benefits. This would allow the VA to pay foreign educational institutions and provide education to VA beneficiaries. Without this change, a foreign school is required to maintain a U.S.-based bank account to allow VA to electronically transfer payments for VA beneficiaries and attend their institution. The requirements is keeping some schools from accepting VA payments, which results in fewer choices for our veterans. I want to thank Congresswoman Sherrill for her hard work in crafting this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support its passage. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further discussion on HR 7375? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 7375 favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost?
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 7375.
Without objection. I now call up HR 5738. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 5738 to amend Title
Text is
38
circulated
United
in
States
advance
Code.
pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with, and the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I now recognize Representative Luria to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Text was circulated in
5738.
advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Representative Luria, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Lactation Spaces for Veterans Mom Acts is a bipartisan bill that would ensure that every veterans facility managed by the Department of Veterans Affairs contains a lactation space. Representative Jamie Herrera Butler joined me in introducing this bill in 2021, and I want to thank her for her leadership on this issue. Just to describe it quickly, we've already made progress in putting lactation spaces in VA healthcare centers, but those have primarily been designed for the staff who work there. This will add the access to those for nursing mothers and patrons of the VA to be able to have access to that types of facilities as well. So I want to thank Representative Herrera Butler for working with me on this. As mothers ourselves, I think we know that this is important and something we should offer to all women who've served and who are making use of VA facilities. And I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Luria. Is there further debate on the Luria amendment? Ranking Member Bost?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Strengthening services for women veterans is a priority of mine, and I know it is of yours as well and many of our colleagues. One way we do this is by ensuring that the VA medical facilities have safe, clean, private spaces for veterans mothers to use the breastfeed or pump. I thank the Congresswoman Luria for introducing the bill and for offering an amendment to improve it. And with that, I'm pleased to support both, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further discussion on the Luria amendment? If not, are we short again? Okay. All right. How many were short?
I count 17.
Okay. So is there further debate on the Luria amendment? Hearing or seeing none. The question is now on the amendment by Representative Luria. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further debate on H.R. 5738? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for an motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the committee report H.R. 5738 as amended favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost?
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and dissenting views on H.R. 5738 as amended.
Without objection. I now call up H.R. 7335. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 7335 to improve coordination between Veterans Health Administration and Veterans Benefits Administration with respect to claims.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read, and I'm open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Ms. Luria for 5 minutes to discuss her bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As already highlighted in this hearing, and I thank Ms. Mace for bringing up issues as well relative to military sexual trauma, this bill includes several provisions from we have gathered from veterans themselves, veteran service organizations who are advocating on behalf of these veterans, and have brought to our attention. And truly, we've discovered that the Veterans Benefits Administration, the Veterans Health Administration, too often operate in silos and don't have adequate coordination. So this bill, the Military Sexual Trauma Claims Coordination Act, seeks to fix this. Also, due to the sensitive nature of military sexual trauma claims and the fact that these do touch on the responsibilities of both of these administrations, it's imperative that they can coordinate better internally. Also, we live in a digital era, and we want to make sure that the VA process, including MST claims, leverages all technology that's available to be able to help with this process. So it does also include technical provisions relative to using technology for notifications and processing of claims, as well as increasing the speed at which survivors are notified of the processing of their claims. So I want to thank Mr. Chairman and others on the committee. I know Mr. Bost as well have been very focused on this issue, and thank you for the opportunity to provide this legislation, which provides some fixes that are common issues we've heard about from our veterans and our communities, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Luria. Information is power, but access to information is empowering. Given the traumatic nature of MST, equipping veterans with information about the MST claims process may help to ease the apprehension that may be associated with pursuing MST claims. The outreach materials mandated through this proposed legislation will provide MST survivors a variety of resources on how to pursue and file claims, identify mental health resources for treatment, and contact information for the Veterans Crisis Line should the need arise. And by improving the notification mechanisms between VHA and VBA, veteran survivors of MST will benefit from claims coordination between the administrations, which will hopefully lead to a more streamlined MST claims process and accelerated compensation decisions, and also avoid the complications that often lead to frustration among veterans. I thank you, Chair Luria, for offering this important legislation, and I urge all my colleagues to support it. Is there further discussion on H.R. 7335?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support enhancing coordination between VHA and VBA. To that end, I appreciate that this bill will require VBA to provide claimants with the outreach materials on VHA services for MST survivors. Additionally, this legislation would allow veterans to opt in to a requirement that the VBA notify VHA when the veteran receives a disability exam or broader hearing for a claim related to MST. This would allow VHA to be better informed about events in the claims process that may cause distress to the MST survivor in order to improve their care. And I want to thank Chairwoman Luria for introducing this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there further discussion on H.R. 7335? If not, Ms. Mace, I understand you want to speak on the legislation?
On HR 2326?
On H.R. 337, no, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, Ms. Mace. Is there any further discussion on H.R. 7335? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 7335 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. If, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 7335.
Without objection. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 2326. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 2326.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Ms. Mace for 5 minutes to discuss her bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Ranking Member Bost as well for including today H.R. 2326, the Veteran Cyber Risk Awareness Act, on today's markup. As we all know, there are criminals looking to prey on unsuspecting internet users, and nowadays it seems everyone is at risk of identity theft, scams, disinformation, fraud, spread via the internet and social media. In fact, I just had a constituent who's a veteran the other day having to deal with identity theft claims in South Carolina. But despite all these threats, many individuals are not aware of the risks that they face online or aware of what they're consuming, clicking, liking, and following online. And this is why Ranking Member Bost and I introduced H.R. 2326, and I want to thank Congressman Bost for his support on this bill and working together. This bill directs the VA's Office of Public and Intergovernmental Affairs to conduct a communications and outreach campaign to provide information and materials to veterans about cyber risks in coordination with other experts. The VA is well equipped to communicate with millions of veterans, but the department really should rely on other federal agencies and private sector experts to provide the most up-to-date information on the cyber risks our veterans face online. When there was an investigation launched into violent extremist groups last year, it was very clear to me in the hearing that the possible targeted recruitment of veterans, it was clear that we lacked crucial data to determine whether veterans are actually more vulnerable to cyber risks than other civilians or other communities online. And last week's hearing also again made clear that we lack this very important information and data. So I'm skeptical that veterans are somehow less capable of making informed decisions online than their peers. However, we will not know that unless we know for sure and have a comprehensive study. So that's why this legislation would also require an independent study on veterans' vulnerability to cyber risks and the effectiveness of this outreach campaign. I'm proud to say this bill is supported by the Disabled American Veterans, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Student Veterans of America, Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the Wounded Warrior Project. And I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their support and looking forward to passing this common sense legislation today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Mace. Is there further debate on H.R. 2326?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, I want to thank you for including Congresswoman Mace in my bill, H.R. 2326, the Veteran Cyber Risk Awareness Act, at today's markup. This bill would require VA to create communications and outreach campaigns to educate veterans about the cyber risk. Cyber risk could include disinformation, fraud, and other internet scams. The bill would also require VA to contract out a study to examine the effectiveness of communications and outreach campaign, as well as the veterans' vulnerability to cyber risk. And I'm glad the chairman has agreed to allow this legislation to be marked up today. Mr. Buckley's testimony at the full committee hearing last week made clear that we can do more to provide veterans with information about how to protect themselves from online threats. Whether the threat is from a bad actor seeking to commit fraud or other harm against a veteran, or the individual seeking to recruit veterans into violent domestic extremist organizations. Veterans, like anyone else, are targets. And I believe this bill is the common sense step to address many of the issues that were raised last week. And I thank the chairman for his support of the bill, and I urge members to support its passage. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion on H.R. 2326? Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. This bill is designed to support work that VA is currently doing to help educate veterans on cyber risks. And while this bill addresses an issue separate from efforts to combat extremism, despite some statements to the contrary, it's a good consumer protection practice to provide veterans with information about online threats and scams, and I support the bill. Is there further debate on 2326? If not, I'll recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee report H.R. 2326 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And without objection, staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the committee's amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and/or supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 2326.
Without objection. I now call up H.R. 7158. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 7158.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost in support of the bill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to support this bill today, and I thank Congressman Higgins for his introducing it. One of the core values is ensuring that our veterans are empowered to choose how, where, and when they use the care, benefits, and services that they've earned and through their time in service to the greatest extent possible. The Long-Term Care Veterans Choice Act would support the goal by authorizing VA to cover the cost of care in a medical foster home for veterans who would otherwise be eligible for VA paid nursing home care. This would ensure that the veterans with service-connected disabilities rated at least 70% do not have to give up care in a medical foster home only because they cannot afford to pay for it themselves. This bill does have a high discretionary cost of $205 million and over 5 years, according to CBO. However, it does not tell the whole story. In addition to being the preference of many aging veterans, medical foster homes are also significantly less expensive than nursing homes. VA estimates that this bill would save approximately $146 million over 5 years. However, the CBO does not factor any anticipated cost savings because they can't. The Long-Term Care Veterans Choice Act is the right thing for veterans and for taxpayers. I hope that every member of this committee will join me in supporting it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. I appreciate Mr. Higgins' continued focus on ensuring veterans have access to numerous long-term care options. One of the most innovative is VA's medical foster home program, which allows veterans who are no longer able to live independently to live in homes with ordinary families rather than having to rely on institutional care. Satisfaction with the program is high, but veterans have to pay for the care themselves, which is a barrier for some veterans. Now, VA is currently prohibited from paying for a veteran's room and board. This legislation would change that, and I understand that some of my colleagues might raise eyebrows over CBO's score, but I would remind them that CBO's estimate does not take into consideration the significant potential cost savings to VA by preventing veterans from being forced into much more expensive institutional care settings. And therefore, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation because I view it as critical. Is there further discussion on H.R. 7158? I understand, Mr. Rosendale, you would like to be recognized. Mr. Rosendale?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very glad to see the Long-Term Care Veterans Choice Act brought forward today. There are very few instances when a good health care program comes along that isn't a trade-off in some form or fashion. And in many fewer times, one of these programs actually makes it to the VA. It sounds like a fantasy to be able to provide quality care in a comfortable environment with better outcomes for less cost. Well, the fact is, the medical foster home is exactly that program. In multiple studies, veterans under the care of a medical foster home have had better health outcomes compared to veterans in nursing homes with similar levels of comorbidity at a lower cost. Here are some findings I've come across. Compared to veterans in nursing, those in medical foster homes had 20% fewer avoidable hospitalizations, 39% fewer bed days used, and about 10% less mortality. And in at least one study, $74 per day less to care for the veteran. Like I said before, it's rare that one such program comes along, and I believe that it is high time to build on such astounding successes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. Is there any further discussion on H.R. 7158? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee report H.R. 7158 favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional or dissenting views on H.R. 7158.
Without objection. H.R. 5754, we will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 5754. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 5754.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost in support of the bill for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Patient Advocacy Tracker Act would require VA to ensure the veterans are able to submit complaints to patient advocates and track the status of those complaints online. The idea for this bill came from Cameron Zabrowski, a Navy veteran during his time as a VFW SVA Student Veteran Fellow. It is sponsored by Congressman Lisa McClain and from Michigan, and I am thankful to both Cameron and Congresswoman McClain for their hard work. I'm fully supportive of their efforts, and I know the veterans will benefit from it for years to come. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Ranking Member Bost, is there further discussion on H.R. 5754? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee report H.R. 5754 favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member
pursuant
Bost.
to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional or dissenting views on H.R. 5754.
Without objection. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6064. Clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 6064, to direct the Secretary of Veterans
Text was
Affairs.
circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Mr. Nels for 5 minutes to discuss his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including H.R. 6064 on today's agenda, and I'd also like to thank Chair Luria for joining me on this bill as the lead Democrat co-sponsor. H.R. 6064 would authorize a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine review of VA's procedures for military sexual trauma-related claims. One element of the National Academy study would focus on the adequacy of disability benefits questionnaires related to MST. DBQs are forms used by VA raters to determine whether a condition is service-connected as well as the associated rating. And I have heard concerns from VSOs these forms are outdated for physical health conditions linked to MST. If the DBQ is not sufficient to describe the veteran's disabilities, the veteran may receive an improper denial or incorrect rating. And that is unacceptable, and it must be addressed today. It is unacceptable that a 2021 GAO report found contract disability exams related to MST will return for correction at a 10% rate, which was twice the rate for other types of contract exams. That is why the National Academies would also examine VA's training for disability examiners who conduct exams for conditions related to MST. I believe the National Academies can help identify why these exams are returned at a higher rate so that the VA can enhance its training to prevent these errors. Veterans should receive a quality exam the first time. It's plain and simple. Additionally, the National Academies would provide recommendations for how VA can improve the disability claims and exam process for MST survivors. For years, the National Academies have provided expert insight into ways VA can better serve veterans. And although VA has made some changes to the way it handles MST-related claims, I believe more can be done to make this process easier for survivors, and the study authorized under my bill would do just that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nels. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Given the unfortunate prevalence of MST among veterans and the broad and long-lasting impacts it can have on a survivor, it makes sense to have a neutral research party assess the adequacy of compensation examinations conducted by VA examiners to ensure we are fully addressing the needs of our veterans who face this horrific experience. The sensitive nature of MST evaluations necessitates competent and compassionate care. In order to guarantee medical and mental health practitioners are able to provide appropriate compensation examinations and having a better comprehension of the academic preparation and credentialing of practitioners will allow VA to adjust and amend existing policy as needed. Now, the National Academies of Science provide independent and objective research that informs public policy. And to that end, an empirical review of the practitioner training needs associated with MST compensation examinations can only bolster stakeholder confidence in the overall process, improve customer service, and augment claim decisions to benefit veterans who experience MST. And as such, I thank Ranking Member Nels for offering this legislation. I do urge my colleagues to support it. Is there further debate on H.R. 6064? Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully support H.R. 6064, which was introduced by Congressman Nels and the ranking member of the DAMA subcommittee. For too long, we've heard that the MST claims process is not sensitive to the needs of survivors. It's time for an independent look into this process in order to identify improvements to VA's delivery of the benefits related to MST. The National Academy for Expertise needs to provide insight into the quality of MST-related claims. For decades, the National Academy has led research into the VA disability benefits process, including reports on the health effects of toxic exposure and VA handling of traumatic brain injuries and claims. And I'm grateful to DAMA Ranking Member Nels for introducing this important piece of legislation. I ask for its support, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Bost. Is there any further discussion on H.R. 6064? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee report H.R. 6064 favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
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 All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority and supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6064.
Without objection. I advise all committee members, whether in the room or online, online to bear with us, stay here, keep the quorum up. We've just got 2 more bills to consider, and we're on the final stretch, almost final stretch, right? So I now call up H.R. 7153. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 7153, to direct the Secretary of
Text was
Veterans
circulated in
Affairs.
advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost to offer an amendment.
I have an amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of substitute at the desk.
Clerk will designate the ANS.
Amendment in the nature of a
The text
substitute.
was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Ranking Member Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The VBA is now embracing automation more than ever before, and with some success. When used properly, it can increase employee efficiency, reduce errors, and dramatically speed up the claims process. However, I am concerned that the VA has already started multiple automation projects without any consent, guidance, or when, why, or how the automation should be used. The train has left the station, and we need to catch it. My amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 7153 would establish a sense of Congress that the VA should increase automation in benefits processing according to certain principles. Automation should be used to increase the speed, accuracy, and consistency of claims processing. Automation should enhance employees' productivity. However, it should not be used to eliminate or reduce the VBA workforce. Employees should always make the final decision about approving claims and granting benefits. Let me be clear. The sense of Congress is that the automation should enhance and support VBA employees, not replace them. Additionally, automation should always protect veterans' privacy and preserve their rights to due process. I think these guiding principles will improve the claims process for veterans and beneficiaries. Finally, my amendment in the nature of a substitute would require VA to submit a plan to Congress to modernize VBA's IT systems over the next 5 years. I ask all of my colleagues to support this amendment, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. This legislation provides clarification on the sense of Congress on the automation of benefits claims and requires VA to submit to Congress a plan for the modernization of the information technology systems of the Veterans Benefits Administration. As VA moves toward greater automation, we must ensure that VA does automation and IT updates the right way for the workforce and to improve, not further complicate the IT situation and make sure all stakeholders are comfortable with the approach. We must ensure VA takes a consistent approach across systems, programs, and automation efforts. It is also important for VA to identify systems in need of modernization to support successful implementation of bills such as the PACT Act and recent presumptions added by the Department. I would like to reinforce on the topic of automation. It is not the intent of Congress or VA to use the automation of claims as a cause to eliminate, reduce, and contract out the duties of the VBA workforce. We intend to conduct close oversight of its use and potential expansion. This legislation is part of those efforts. Now, when implemented the right way, automation has the potential to reduce the day-to-day burden of employees by diminishing menial tasks and allowing them to focus on the kind of work that truly needs a human touch. And as such, I support this legislation and encourage my colleagues to support this as well. Is there further debate on the Bost amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment by Representative Bost, and all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further debate on H.R. 7153? If not, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H.R. 7153 as amended favorable to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments. Ranking Member Bost.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice to intent to file minority, supplemental, additional, and/or dissenting views on H.R. 7153 as amended.
Without objection. All right. I now call up H.R. 6604. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 6604.
Text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. I now recognize Ranking Member Bost to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute.
The text was circulated in advance pursuant to committee rules. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of amendment. Ranking Member Bost, you are recognized for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment, in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 6604, Veterans Eligibility to Transfer School or Vets Credit Act, would retain the base text, but would also insert text of H.R. 6458, sponsored by Congressman Murphy of North Carolina. The base text of H.R. 6604, sponsored by Congressman Bachman of Florida, would require VA to provide students that qualify with a new streamlined way to apply for restored benefits following a school's closure. This will help students find the right school for them more quickly. My amendment in the nature of a substitute would also include the text from H.R. 6458 that would eliminate the requirements to set a date for when the transferred post-9/11 GI Bill benefits would expire. By doing so, we would prevent those who are entitled to these benefits from accidentally inputting the wrong date. These wrong dates have led to dependents being barred from taking advantage of their education benefits. I want to thank the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, or TAPS, for bringing this transfer issue and solution to us. And I want to thank both Congressman Bachman and Murphy for their hard work on this bill. I urge all members to support the amendment, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost. The amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6604 combines H.R. 6604 with H.R. 6458 from Representatives Murphy and Trone. Now, these two pieces of legislation, which we will consider as H.R. 6604, would make two important changes for veterans. First, the ANS would require that VA provide students that qualify a new provisional certificate of eligibility for benefits that may be restored. Now, what that means is if a student veteran is left in the unfortunate situation where their school closes, they will be provided detailed information from VA on how to have their benefits restored or transferred to a new institution. Second, the ANS would ensure that clerical errors don't rob veterans of transferring their benefits to a dependent. Under current law, if a service member accidentally makes a mistake in their paperwork, such as indicating an expiration date for the benefits, and the service member passes away before the benefits are used, there is no way for the paperwork to be changed to allow the dependent to use the benefits. Now, what this bill does is it clarifies existing law and ensures that clerical errors do not prevent dependents from receiving educational assistance. I thank all the members who have worked on this package, and I urge support of the amendment in nature of substitute. Now, is there further debate on the Bost amendment? If not, the question is on the Bost amendment in the nature of a substitute by Representative Bost. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is there further debate on H.R. 6604? Hearing or seeing none, I recognize Ranking Member Bost for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I will move the committee report H.R. 6604 as amended favorably to the full House of Representatives.
All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes in the committee amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Ranking Member Bost.
pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2, I give notice of intent to file minority or supplemental additional and/or dissenting views on H.R. 6604 as amended.
Without objection. Now, this concludes the business of the markup. Does the ranking member or any member wish to be recognized before we adjourn?
I do.
Ranking Member Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am grateful to the efforts of every member that had a bill out here today that we moved forward. And I also want to say a special thank you to the members to make sure that we tried to keep a quorum present at all times on a very, very, very busy day. I look forward to considering these bills on the floor, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you and your staff for the hard work you've worked with us on, and thank you very much, and I yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Bost, and as you said in your opening remarks, I do want to close this markup in my recognition of the very sad news that Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas, a Marine veteran and fierce advocate, died yesterday from stage 4 breast cancer. And despite struggling with her disease, she continued fighting on behalf of the millions of veterans who were similarly exposed to toxic substances as a result of their military service. She did give her last days to us, fighting for the passage of comprehensive toxic exposure legislation. And we are very grateful for that. Her strength was palatable and striking. And while my interaction with Kate was brief, hers is a memory I will not forget as we carry forward the banner she so boldly and unselfishly shouldered. May she rest in peace. And with that, thank you all for your attendance, and this meeting is adjourned.